I think they're not sure what to do once Ukraine wins. I mean, there's concern about a if Putin is losing and the regime collapses, what do we do? What happens? And I think there's anxiety about that, which I also think is wasted energy. We should not be afraid of Russian collapse. We should think about what do we do? How do we prepare for it? But the regime collapsed after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was no chaos. Nuclear weapons didn't go flying everywhere. I mean, I think that's part of their hesitation.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Sanderson. And today we're catching up with Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He served 38 years in the Army, commanding in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was Commander US Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. General Hodges, welcome back to Frontline. Good to see you again.
Thank you very much.
We're speaking as the Russian Black Sea Fleet has sustained a series of major attacks with a strike on its headquarters. Ukraine is saying its commander has been killed, but the Russians are showing footage of him as we speak today. We don't know the truth of all this as we speak right now. But how much more coordinated have the attacks on Crimea been?
I think there's 3 or 4 aspects of this situation that are worth exploring. Number one, you're right. It's not confirmed whether or not the admiral himself was actually killed. We've all looked at that video. I've reached out to Ukrainian friends and others, and it's just not 100% clear. But when we were in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we killed the emir of Mosul a dozen times. I mean, killing the leader is not necessarily going to have the big effect, but what may have had a very damaging effect to the Russian Black Sea Fleet was, if the report is true, that there were 25 or 35 officers with him, staff, subordinate commanders. That would be devastating to lose that much of the leadership, which is responsible for actually doing all the staff work and coordination. And if you would have to replace all of them, they're coming from somewhere else. So that would be quite a shot on their talent pool, if you will. So I think that's going to be significant down the road, whether or not the admiral himself is gone. Number two, of course, this was just not some lucky shot by a couple of storm shadows, and we've all looked at the video. Incredible precision against a military facility. There is the reporting that says the targeting information came from unhappy Russian officers who would not receive their salary, and that they had provided information to partisan organizations inside Crimea. That's not verified, but it seems entirely believable. This is part of a series of events where the Ukrainians have conducted a very sophisticated series of attacks against radar, against air defense, against the dry dock, which is really important to destroy the maintenance capacity of the Black Sea Fleet, not to mention the submarine and the other vessel that they destroyed or severely damaged, and then to hit the headquarters itself in this kind of a sophisticated way. Really very effective thinking tactically, but also with, I think, some serious operational level effect.
It's really interesting when you talk about how little verified information there is. And I'm just wondering, when you have those kind of rumors swirling around about how that targeting was done, how many people were killed, what kind of effect does that actually have on the morale of those military people that have to carry on with the day-to-day?
So on the Russian side, of course, it in a system that is so centralized, when you lose commanders, you lose a headquarters. It is some will see it as a disaster, others will see it as a relief. Are good. We won't be getting orders from these guys for a while, but this in a situation where their logistics is already a mess, their air defense is not properly coordinated or very effective there in Crimea. This will be a real concern, and especially for people that are there, civilians that are there, the ones that are pro-Russian, they will begin to realize that Russia cannot actually defend this place properly. On the other side, it should give lie to the notion that somehow Crimea is just too strong. The Ukrainians could never, ever eject them from it. And I think the Ukrainians are showing that they do have the ability if given enough time, and if we, the UK, France, US, Germany, continue to provide capability, then they will make Crimea untenable for Russian Navy and Russian Air Force.
Just to continue on the Black Sea Fleet, the Ministry of Defence in the UK says, although the damage is severe, that it's also localised. It says the fleet certainly remains capable of fulfilling its core wartime missions. What are those missions exactly?
So I saw that report from the UK's MOD, which I think has been on target from the beginning. That's my most reliable government sources, UK MOD intelligence reports. The Russians still have several ships that can launch missiles against civilian targets in Ukraine. So that's going to continue. They're able to move some of these vessels back and forth to the Caspian Sea over the Don Volga rivers and the canal that connects those two rivers. But how much longer can they do that? And really, that's the value of making Sevastopol untenable for the Russian Navy, that they would have to reposition to Novorossiysk, which is about another, I think, 400 kilometers to the east. That will make it much more difficult for them to continue these sorts of missile strikes. And that Novorossiysk is not the same, does not have the same capabilities that Sevastopol has for maintenance, refueling, and rearming. The other thing that it struck me is that Ukraine has been hammering the Russian Black Sea Fleet now in a variety of different ways, even though Ukraine does not have a navy per se of its own, surface vessels that go out and do combat in the traditional sense. They've used a variety of drones, shore-based missiles, now cruise missiles, to push the Black Sea Fleet away from the western end of the Black Sea, which is why now you're starting to see grain deliveries moving again. That's impressive that Ukraine did that without a navy, but it also says something about the poor level of readiness and capability of the Russian Black Sea Fleet.
But yet that MOD assessment in the UK, it also said that the wider regional security patrols and the de facto blockade of Ukrainian ports, that they will be affected, but not affecting the drone strikes on Odessa, for example.
Well, of course, as long as Russia has the long-range capability that it does, Iskander missiles and others, they can continue to launch those and Shahed drones against Odessa. That's a fact. Another reason that we have to help Ukraine eject Russia from Crimea to reduce Russia's ability, make them have to move further to the east, make them have to defend other areas, to reduce the amount of strikes that are happening against Black Sea ports.
Storm Shadow missiles were used to target, as you mentioned, the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. And now it seems that we're on the brink of the US agreeing to send the long-range ATACAMS missiles, something you have long called for. Would it be a game changer?
This is maddening. It has taken so long to get to this point, and I'm still not convinced yet. I mean, there's been all kind of reporting about it, which means there were deliberate leaks put out, but I haven't heard without a doubt from the Secretary of Defense or the White House that, yes, we are providing this with this type of munition and blah, blah, blah. So it's still, I mean, even if they have finally, thank God, made the decision to do it, the communications plan on something so big is terrible. I mean, not what you would expect on a decision that took them 19 months to finally get there. Now, never look a gift horse in the mouth. If what I'm hearing is accurate, the type of ATACMS rocket that's being provided will carry cluster munitions. That's a good thing for some targets. And they'll have the range and the precision. That's a good thing. But nobody asked me, of course, but if they had, I would have preferred the 300-kilometer unitary round, the type that makes a gigantic hole in buildings. in airfields and in bridges and in ships. The cluster munition will be effective against radar, against some types of facilities. So it'll help, but it's not going to be a game changer.
So it is unclear what the numbers are, well, whether it's happening at all, what the numbers are, when it would happen. The variant you're talking about, which one is it exactly? And would it need to be refurbished to be used? Is it ready?
Yes, these are weapons that we have and that we use. So the type of munition it is a rocket that uses the cluster, has cluster munitions, the bomblets, and so it can cover a larger area with smaller bomblets, similar to the 155 millimeter cluster munition artillery rounds that we've provided, except now you're talking about significantly longer range, greater distance. But what I don't know is, okay, the administration, when do they actually make the decision? If they have they already directed transport begin to get these things into Rzeszów in Poland and then onward into Ukraine? Where is that? Or are they still sitting in a depot somewhere? I don't know that.
And what could they be used for exactly? How do they fit into Ukraine's strategy?
Well, if you think about Jankoy, for example, this is a large logistics hub at the north end of the Crimean Peninsula. It's a very important logistics base. It's also an airfield where a lot of helicopters are flying. This that place is tailor made for a cluster munition rocket like that. Relatively soft targets over a larger area. I would imagine that's the kind of target that the Ukrainians would be looking for that would have a significant impact. I mean, if you could destroy several helicopters, logistics that are trucks that are out there, that could be very effective against that.
You're always keen to stress that this is all part of a multi-domain war. Can you just talk to me about those domains and how they're being coordinated by each side to fit into their strategy?
Yeah, I have been impressed with how they are using everything in the toolbox that they have. We're talking about the ground assault, which is what we focused on, with the trenches and the minefields and all that. But that was only the land component of a multi-domain operation. You've got these drone strikes that we've been talking about against Crimea, against other places inside of Russian-occupied Ukraine, drones and missiles. You've got commando raids that are being used to take out radar. There are partisan or sabotage operations going on in the rear area which has a really significant corrosive effect on the Russian logistics system. And then the Ukrainians, of course, adapted their attacks to focus more on Russian artillery to take that out. So all of these things together, and this is why we in the West, in NATO, in the UK, in the US, we do what we used to call joint operations. Now we call it multi-domain, where you bring together all the different tools in a synchronized way that gets a much greater effect. And one of the most important effects that this achieves is massive pressure on the Russian general staff. I mean, not only are they being targeted, but they don't know where the next thing is coming from. The Ukrainian general staff looks to me to have much better intelligence about what's going on, and they have the initiative. And it looks to me that they are running rings around the Russian general staff. Think about what's happening every time a drone goes anywhere near a Russian commercial airport. That airport shuts down. All right, that has economic impact, but you can be sure that the MOD is catching all kind of hell because why can't you protect Russian airspace? So this puts a lot of pressure on commanders there as well.
And is that having an impact back home in Russia if you've got that kind of uncertainty?
That's the great question, Kate, and I can't tell. Russia is not like UK or US where people would be angry about what was going on. The parliament or the Congress would be raising hell with the prime minister or the president. Putin doesn't have to worry about any of that. He doesn't have to worry about a journalist putting a microphone in his face. He's not accountable to anybody for what's going on. And my sense is that at least for the last 100 years, Russia has not been the kind of place where you would get major protests in the streets. Yes, there have been protests, but the security apparatus inside of Russia is just suffocating, and so I don't think you're going to see, certainly not yet, as much as I would like it,
Um,
the
sorry to
kind of
interrupt.
protests and real anger in domestic Russia.
Just to continue a bit on the multi-domain aspect of the war, you talk about how well the Ukrainians have mastered this. What about the Russian forces?
So another great question. First of all, they're not stupid. They are learning. I spoke to a Ukrainian friend of mine earlier today who had recently captured some Russian soldiers, and depending on where they come from, some of them are guys that were just grabbed off the street or poorly trained. But then he recently captured two that were from let's say, a more established unit that was, and they were much better equipped, much better trained. So there is a sort of an unevenness in the Russian forces, which I guess is not to be, it would not be a surprise. Um, I can't tell how much better they are on being able to respond to what Ukraine is doing. I mean, I look at these endless trenches, and they look very rudimentary. I mean, soldiers have a very hard time surviving in those things. I can't tell that they have fixed their logistics system yet. They still rely on mass, but where they are really good, uh, and you get this from Ukrainians, the Russians are very good at using their own drones, and they are really good at electronic warfare, being able to jam, being able to intercept. That's a problem for the Ukrainians.
The Institute for the Study of War, in its most recent available update, says that Ukraine is inflicting losses on Russian manpower and equipment and depleting Russian forces along the entire front line. It's being reported elsewhere that Russia is creating new brigades along its defensive lines in the Donbass and is intensifying efforts to regain lost positions. I mean, winter's approaching. I just wonder how long this attrition can continue in this vein without, I mean, the will to fight at some point must break, mustn't it?
Yes, and as you and I have talked about before, that war is a test of will as well as a test of logistics. Um, Russia, of course, has the ability to keep pulling people from the hinterland to create new units. So they will, for some time, have the advantage of mass, but putting people in uniform with a helmet and a rifle and pushing them into a fight is mass. I don't know how effective that is in terms of real combat power that could threaten a breakthrough on the Ukrainian side or present a real threat against Ukraine in an area. The logistics, I tell you what, I would hate to be a Russian private as winter approaches,
Mm.
um,
I
knowing
suppose
that there's.
I suppose what I'm sort of trying to get at is if you have, as is often said, Ukrainian soldiers being well looked after, questions being raised as to when they get their rest, when you rotate the troops around. If you compare that to the mass that the Russian and the fact that they have the moral high ground in terms of their fighting, it's an existential fight for them. If you compare that to the Russians who can just replace and replace and replace and replace, how do those two mismatches fit into the whole capabilities of each force?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I think the Ukrainians know that the way you defeat mass is by, with long range precision, destroying logistics and destroying artillery. Without logistics, which is ammunition, food, fuel, and as it gets colder, the things that they'll need. Without the logistics, then that mass is much less of a problem. So I think this is how the Ukrainians negate the only advantage that the Russians have.
The argument is being made for a change in US policy to allow US military advisors to be deployed to Ukraine to give on the ground advice to Ukraine's troops rather than Ukrainians having to leave their country to be trained elsewhere. Would you support that idea, and what difference do you think that would make?
Well, yes, I would support it, but only if it was within the context of my president specifying what the objective for the war is. I mean, we've got, unfortunately, the last 80 years, 75 years of history of backing into conflicts by bits and pieces, provide equipment, provided, oh, we better get some advisors. Oh, we need a few more advisors. Next thing you know, Americans are getting killed, and we still haven't heard what's it for. And the Americans, and just like Brits, I think will support something like this for a long time if we know what it's for. And when we don't know what it's for, then it's harder to say, okay, why are we spending this money, or why do we have troops there? So I think the president has got to say explain to the American people why this is important, why we're doing this. If he does that, then you can have policies that are hooked into a desired strategic outcome.
What difference do you think military advisors could make?
Well, the Ukrainians absolutely do not need any help from us on how do you fight the Russians. I mean, hopefully we are all taking notes from them. That really should be a focus. Where we could be helpful is on helping build up their logistics and maintenance networks. I mean, they've got so many different pieces of equipment from so many different countries. That's a good thing, but it also, you can imagine what the maintenance problem and the burden that is on your getting repair parts in and so on. So some expertise in the field of building up a logistics network, helping them do maintenance on some of these sophisticated systems. They learn very, very quickly, but being able to help them uh, build up their pool of soldiers who are maintainers. I think this is an area they surely are going to need it with the F-16s.
Yeah, and the US has pledged a further $325 million in aid. You point out that President Biden, as you said, hasn't outlined the US's strategic objective. Why doesn't he do that?
This is, I'm pulling out what little hair I still have thinking about this because, this is like first day of staff college. You have to identify the objective. What's the purpose of why we're doing the mission? And the White House has not done this. Now, they're not stupid. These are all incredibly intelligent, hardworking, dedicated public servants. But there is a reluctance. And I think it goes to number one, they're very, very concerned, excessively so, about some sort of Russian escalation. I mean, Crimea is getting pounded right now. Contrary to what Elon Musk said, the Russians have not gone nuclear over that. So I think all of us we are deterring ourselves when it comes to the threat, possibility of a Russian nuclear escalation. That's number one. Number two, I think they're not sure what to do once Ukraine wins. I mean, there's concern about a if Putin is losing and the regime collapses, what do we do? What happens? And I think there's anxiety about that, which I also think is wasted energy. We should not be afraid of Russian collapse. We should think about what do we do? How do we prepare for it? But the regime collapsed after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was no chaos. Nuclear weapons didn't go flying everywhere. I mean, I think that's part of their hesitation. And then finally, I have to think that the Chinese have a role in this somehow, that the Chinese are signaling something. They do not want to see a collapse of the regime. So perhaps that's why the administration says things like, we're with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We want to help them get to a strong negotiating position. This kind of, which I think is
It's very
very
woolly,
unhelpful.
isn't it?
I mean, Putin is hanging on, praying for a Trump reelection. And so every time somebody of note says we need to negotiate, that's oxygen for the Kremlin.
Just to pursue the line on weapons, I just wanted to get your reaction to the events recently of Poland saying it wants to stop supplying Ukraine.
Yeah, this was very unhelpful, and I have seen where some Polish leaders and supporters have tried to back that up and say, "Well, he didn't mean that." Um, I think he absolutely meant that, um, but it was within the context of a Polish election that's coming up here on the 15th of October, and this is going to be a very, very close election, and it's I mean, very tough. And so the ruling party right now is doing and saying a lot of things that appeal to their core voters. That's not unique in history, but it's unhelpful at this time. I mean, that only the Kremlin benefits from that when there are wedges inside a country that, frankly, has been one of the most important supporters of Ukraine until now. But a ban on grain imports, for example, that's not because all of a sudden they don't like Ukrainian grain. It's because they've got Polish wheat farmers that they're trying to support, to whom they're trying to appeal. So I think that's what this is about, and hopefully after the 15th of October, it'll get back on track.
Finally, I just want to draw on your experience having advised the NGO Human Rights First, and wants to ask you about Russia's efforts to rejoin the United Nations Human Rights Council, from which it was expelled, of course, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What does it stand to gain from this?
Well, first of all, that is second in absolute ludicrousness, only to the fact that Iran is going to chair the, the Human Rights Council. I mean, these are the kind of things that drive people absolutely bonkers. People like me that want to support the UN, that believe in the UN Charter, that believe in the international rules-based order, but then you've got Iran and Russia own it or wanting to get back into it. I mean, it undermines the credibility of the institution and the organization. Now, I think once Vladimir Putin and his Minister for Children's Rights have both been convicted by the ICC, and you start going down the list of all the other Russian war criminals who are responsible for the murder of thousands of Ukrainians. Once that's all taken care of, then maybe Russia's in a different place.
Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.